You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.
Hello, Dana. Welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. Thank you for making time for us again.
Thanks for having me, Rachel.
Today we are talking about something that I suspect we have both experienced, which is spiritual imposter syndrome. And we're going to get right into the big question. What does spirituality mean to you?
Oh, it is such a big question.
Well, just 5 words or less.
I think before we answer that question, can we just say that this conversation, our intention behind this conversation, I think I'll feel better if we kind of start with that, is really to be expansive for people who perhaps feel like they have spiritual imposter syndrome and it's holding them back in any way. And I think, neither of us are really experts on spirituality, but we have just want to share our experience and our thoughts on that today.
Yeah, I think this topic came up for both of us because we are heading into an online version of the Yoga Medicine 200-hour teacher training. And it really, I don't know about you, but it really took my memories back to preparation for my own teacher training and this very central and visceral fear that I was not going to be enough. So I know a lot of people go into training thinking, I'm not sure if I want to teach. I did. I knew I wanted to teach. I just didn't think I'd be good enough, wise enough, all the things enough to actually guide people through something that was so precious to me. And I think the question that comes up for a lot of us is, am I spiritual enough to be teaching yoga as opposed to just, teaching a movement practice of some kind? So you're right. I think the background is really important to kind of set the scene that it could be holding us back from taking a training at all, or it could be holding us back even once we're qualified to mention anything, even tangentially related to the spiritual realm.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And we'll get into sort of where I came from. I think is a different place that you came from, which was both really interesting. So let's answer your question.
All right.
So I really love Brené Brown's definition of spirituality. So I just
you and Valerie, huge Brené Brown fans.
She just puts it together really well. So she says, spirituality is recognizing and celebrating that we are all inextricably connected to each other by a power greater than all of us, and that our connection to that power and to one another is grounded in love and compassion. Practicing spirituality brings a sense of perspective, meaning, and purpose to our lives. So I love this because it really is, it just offers so much space and options. And, it's not like you have to do this to be spiritual. And the fact that it comes back to love and compassion, like, I think if I was to really, I just think spirituality is about being a really decent human being.
Or at least trying.
Trying.
Yeah. Let's not set the bar too high.
Trying. And a way to, can I use the word transcend? To transcend some of the ugly parts of being human and some of the things that we're not proud of. We all make mistakes, and it gives you tools and mindset, a way of really, rising above some of the things that we do as humans that we probably regret or wish we didn't do or say. Yeah.
I love that. And the themes that I hear coming through is firstly connection to all the parts of ourselves, to each other, to nature, to the world around us, to the universe. And then that sense of being not just connected, but that we are part of something much bigger than ourselves. And having that as an aspirational thing, that it would encourage us to be bigger than our small desires and small drives, which we all experience every day.
And which are totally fine to have.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's uh, maybe where spirituality sometimes can go wrong,
Mm.
in that sense of feeling like you had to get rid of those desires that you have, the human desires. Um, but yes, one thing that you just said, that idea of wholeness,
Mm.
uh, we tend to really put ourselves into boxes or attach lots of labels, kind of see the world as a fragmented kind of place, or even think about ourselves that we might be broken or need fixing. And I think spirituality allows us to find a way, yeah, to return to this idea of wholeness, and that there's nothing broken about us. We don't need fixing. We are whole, and we can begin to see the way that we fit into the world together, like me in the world, but also you and me together, and that sense of cohesion.
Mm. I don't think that that's the message that comes through as clearly on social media. And what a surprise, because it took us, 5 minutes to put words around it. And social media definitely encourages things that are much quicker than that, quick images. And I think the connotation in the yoga world is that spirituality might be related to um, chanting or crystals or chakras or particular hand gestures, that you can kind of symbolize spirituality really quickly and superficially, as opposed to all of that much more complicated and nuanced stuff. So maybe as part of talking about what spirituality is, we talk about maybe what it isn't.
Sure. I think, I think people maybe, um, they can see those symbols that you've mentioned, and kind of go like, oh, well, if like to be spiritual, like I have to meditate holding my crystals, or, I have to balance all the energy in my chakras, or,
Mm,
um, you know, just practicing yoga makes me a spiritual person, or meditating for hours. And it may or it may not. For
mm,
some people, those tools do help them connect to something greater. And so, yes, like you could be, looking at crystals and their energies and their meanings and all that to help you connect to something greater. But by default, just like having crystals in your house doesn't necessarily make you a spiritual person. So it does, yeah, it's like you do need to go deeper than the tool or the gimmick. Um, I think, as we mentioned, like denouncing material possessions, even abstaining from sex, believing in like karma or afterlife, like these are some of the things that people
yeah.
equate with spirituality that don't necessarily have to be equated with spirituality.
Yeah. And there's also a link to, well, is there a link to religion? I mean, I grew up atheist, so I'm not the best person to understand that, but you grew up in a faith that was quite influential on you, at least in your younger years. And at some point you had to reconcile what that meant versus what yoga meant. So maybe talk a little bit about the junctions and the differences between spirituality and religion.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up Jewish, and I went to a really religious Jewish school as well, like extreme religiosity. Um, and so for me, like in my early years, like religion was really harsh and strict, but it was also really beautiful. There was community and connection and faith, faith in the sense of like a source of comfort and trust. Um, and that connection. So I think that there can be an overlap
Mm,
between. I think that religion can foster spirituality, but it can also not, in the same sense of like sometimes with some, depending on the way it's practiced, it could be more of this sort of like blind faith
mm,
that you have. Um, so yeah, I think just by default, like having a religion maybe doesn't make you a spiritual person. It can, because a lot of the teachings of religion are grounded in compassion and love. So I do think there can be an overlap between that. Um, for me, when you mentioned like coming to the teacher training, I remember, I mean, you've heard me say this before, like coming to yoga even was difficult because I had a concept of God, and then I was conflicted about, can I practice yoga if I'm not also believing in the yoga, the Hindi gods, that
Mm-hmm.
come along with the yoga, a lot of yoga mythology and philosophy. And because I came to yoga quite young, at the time, like I was in my teenage years, it wasn't like I had the option to really drive to go check out different studios, or online yoga wasn't the thing either. So
Mm-hmm.
it took me a while to find a yoga that I felt didn't conflict with my religion, and also probably my sense of spirituality at that time, which has
Mm.
definitely evolved. And so going into into yoga teacher training too, I remember just feeling like, what if these concepts conflict with what I know and what I believe? That was definitely tricky to navigate at first.
Mm. And not a thought process that I had to go through. I felt very similar about the Hindu symbols that I saw in yoga as I do if I'm at a house that has a statue of Mary or Jesus, for example. I want to be respectful, just in case. I don't know what happens after. I'm not going to diss anybody's God, that's for sure. But I never felt any sense of it being connected to me other than just, yeah, I want to be careful. I want to be respectful, but I'm going to keep you at a distance if you don't mind. And I have felt very similar about yoga philosophy. There are some aspects of it that I find fascinating. There's many aspects of it that I don't understand at all. And I felt very similar when I read the Bible. There were some bits that made sense and some bits that were a little bit like, wait, what now? So
Yeah.
yeah, I didn't really have to go through the whole thought process that you did as to, is it okay for me to be here? Do these things resonate for me? Is there space for both things to coexist? Yeah, it must have been tough.
Yeah, and depending on which training you do too, I did one that focused a lot on the philosophy, and
Mm,
some of the concepts can be so dense that
mhm,
they can really, I think without a really great teacher or guide, you could be running around in circles in your head trying to understand, not non-dualism and dualism and all these different things. And then, it's really interesting for me because in the Jewish religion, there's like, you are separate from God. You're doing your thing, and God's looking down at you and judging you every single moment of every single day. That's at least the
sounds
strictness that I
delightful.
grew up with. Yeah. Um, and then to come across this concept where you're like, I am God, I can be one with God.
Mhm,
That took a really long time. And so this is where this is what comes back to why I love Brene Brown's definition, or just this idea of being connected by a greater power, is that, um, you know, part of the process, or I think where I ended up is kind of going like, actually, that greater power can be nature.
mhm.
It can be um, the ocean, it can be Mother Earth, it can be the universe, and really allowing for everyone to have their own connection and definition was a big shift that occurred, that that allowed me to move forward with sharing
Mm.
my love for yoga philosophy and spirituality.
So there are some aspects of how you define spirituality that do fit within a religious framework, very similar to how you spoke about some of the tools that we can use, like meditation and mantra and mudra and chanting and crystals and chakras and everything. You can use them to help you become aware of your connection to other people, other things, the world and the universe around you. You can use them to remind you that you are part of something larger than yourself and you're aspiring to be a more ethical person, a better person in all of those relationships that you have. You can also use it as external display. You can also use it to separate you from other people and other things. So like any tool, there are potential ways to use it really powerfully and potential ways to use it that probably take you further away from spirituality. We also, in the preparation for this, talked about a couple of other things that we thought sometimes get muddied in with spiritual waters and probably aren't, like spiritual superiority. I love that phrase. So what are your thoughts on that topic of the person who kind of wields spirituality like a bit of a weapon, better than you in every possible way?
It can be quite damaging. I think going back to like the intention of this conversation, if you've encountered that kind of spiritual superiority, it can really make you feel less than or not enough. For someone who's, going along this journey of wanting to dive deeper into yoga, whether to teach or not to teach, but just to go deeper, can be really off-putting to feel like you have to do certain practices in order to meet that, to rise to that bar of expectations. I think we've both had experiences. I remember I actually had an experience where someone was trying to tell me that I was being spiritually superior. It was right after I finished my 200-hour training, and I decided that I wasn't going to drink for a while, alcohol, and it was not because I did the 200-hour training. It just happened to coincide with a series of things in my life in which the 200-hour training was part of it. That was like, all right, I had kind of come out of a few like really intense years of work hard, party hard, and realizing that that was not a good pattern for me. And or for my partner, and he was getting really fit at the time, and so we both decided, like, let's just abstain from this kind of lifestyle for a little while. Like, let's have a break because it's what's best for our health. And I had a teacher at the time actually give me quite a strong lecture around, like, not going like, oh, you're taking this to the extreme, and feeling quite unseen in that
that's not what it was about
that
for you.
exchange. And so I think there is a lot of that spiritual superiority around, that I think, at least for me, I try to really approach all this with quite an open mind, and that sense of like coming back again to that like connection, and to really understand like everyone has their own path in this, and that it's okay to carve out your own definition, meaning, practices, and really find what works for you.
And in fact, maybe it's not just okay, maybe it is actually the only possible way to have a sense of spirituality that's authentic to you, to have it kind of stem out of your own very unique and personal experiences, and to be informed by things that you read and see around you, but to be very personal. Yeah, I've definitely had the experience of being shamed before, gently, from people who meant it in a very well-intentioned way. The suggestion that my practice should always be enough to support me, whether I'm grieving or whether there's something going on for me physically, that my ways of coping outside of yoga practice was sort of less than. And if I had a really good solid practice, that practice would have been enough. And as I said, that always coming from a well-intentioned place, but a well-intentioned place that was clearly several steps up the spiritual ladder from where I was at. Whereas my stance is, life is hard. It can be wonderful, but it can also be really tough. And we've just all got to muddle through our own way, whichever way we are able to grasp at the moment. And maybe the next time I face that challenge, there'll be a better way to approach it, but maybe there won't. We all just do the best we can.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's kind of similar to, like, when you're perhaps feeling quite emotional and someone
Mm.
comes along and tries to, like, gives you like the logic and the rationale of the situation. You're like, yeah, I know that, but I still feel this way. Like, I still
I've
feel
probably
really
done that
sad,
to people before. Oh,
and I
it's
would
true
just
though.
like to cry.
I know
And I
all of
think,
those things. I still feel crap. Thank you very much.
yeah, and I think you can make that same parallel to like spirituality. It's like sometimes, yeah, you might be grieving and you still have this connection to something greater than yourself, but
Mm.
you still feel how you feel,
Yeah.
and maybe your spiritual practice can help alleviate some of the intensity of the situation, or maybe carry you through it a little bit faster, maybe, but it's still okay to feel how you feel.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and
yeah,
from my perspective, maybe it's okay to be watching Great British Bake Off to forget for 20 minutes how I feel, as opposed to going to meditate and leaning into that. You know, maybe that's okay. Maybe that's how I need to get through the first few days, and it's not really anybody's place to judge whether that's the right or the wrong behavior. We're all just muddling through our own
yeah.
way.
I really want to echo what you said about the authenticity and figuring out, for yourself, really
Mm,
carving out for yourself is the way to make spirituality authentic. And
mhm.
I actually really don't talk much about my spirituality. I mean, if someone asked me a question, I'd be happy to answer as we are today, but it's not something that I openly discuss or divulge because I do. What I really love about spirituality versus religion is that, like, you can really keep your spirituality to yourself if you would
Mhm.
like to do that, versus religion usually means that you're practicing, you're observing, you have traditions, and you might go to a place of worship, or you
Mhm.
might be doing it with your family or your friends or loved ones, whatever. It's sort of that, it's pretty rare to be observing and practicing religion on your own.
There
Whereas
are
with
public forums.
spirituality, yeah,
Mm,
with spirituality, I just one thing that I really love about it. And I remember really early on actually going through as well this journey that I think is really quite common with when perhaps, can we say, like, become spiritual, like when you really connect to your own
mhm,
sense of that connection and that oneness, and you're in a relationship with someone that doesn't have the same, like, shared spirituality practices or beliefs or view of the world. So that happened to me, and it became a lot more apparent after my 200-hour teacher training that it became this conflict in our
mm.
relationship. And I've had like lots of friends over the years, be mostly single friends, who are like, I just really want to meet someone who's spiritual. I really want to meet someone who's spiritual, and not able to get into a relationship. Then they meet these really great people, but then there's just this like hard stop because they're not spiritual enough. I'm doing air
Mm,
quotes for those who can't see me. And that was another sort of reckoning, I guess. Like,
mm.
another way of kind of going like, okay, well, what does spirituality mean to me? And
Yeah.
do I really need that to be reflected in my relationship, or can it be something that gives me comfort and a sense of relaxation and trust? And when I was able to kind of go like, actually, you know what, this is mine, and I don't need to have this be reflected in my, the people around me necessarily.
Mm,
That also really just created such depth for me in my own
mm.
spiritual
Oh, I love that.
practices.
I think of
Yeah.
it in terms of the way that it might apply concretely in life as values that might be a sort of more outward reflection of your spiritual experience. And to me, there's got to be some kind of Venn diagram. There need to be some sort of central values that overlap. Otherwise, we would constantly be in conflict in terms of the way that we see the world. But there's going to be lots of areas on the outside where we differ. And that in fact, that can be really helpful as opposed to just having your worldview always reflected back at you, to have those little reminders periodically to do what you've been talking about all the way through this conversation of sitting with, questioning, reflecting. And that to me is a huge part of living an actual spiritual life, is that there are these regular periods of, is that what I believe? Is that how I feel? Well, then what are the implications of that? And why did I have that response and that reaction? And I think that side of it is much more important than the outward symbols that we were talking about, that can or can't be helpful, really depending on what the internal practice is.
Yeah, and in the sort of evolution that I went through of my own definition of it and experience of religion versus spirituality, and I just saw that in my partner too. I saw that actually he does reflect and consider, and he does have his own way of coming back to the things that we value together, in that sense of love and compassion and kindness and integrity. We do have those. We have a very strong Venn diagram in our relationship of those shared values. And what I began to see as well, that really opened up my whole view of what spirituality can be, is I began to see what he held sacred. And that actually he did hold things sacred. It wasn't the same things I did, but for him, it's the love of the ocean and nature and working with his hands and creating things. I think really brings him into that state of something bigger than himself, because he's often making things for other people, let's just say, to simplify it. And I think that's, I just want to highlight here that if there's something that's really meaningful to you and really sacred that goes beyond yourself, that really simply is spirituality, in my view.
And I would add that the word sacred very rarely comes out of my mouth, as does the word transcend. And that's also okay, because these are really complicated and personal concepts, and they need to have their own language too. Now, we couldn't talk about spirituality and spiritual imposter syndrome without also talking about spiritual bypassing, which I think happens quite a bit in the modern kind of Western yoga world. The whole, only love and light and no darkness and negativity, and, breathe in the good and breathe out the bad, as opposed to, for me, spirituality really does require us to acknowledge all things, the good, the bad, the ugly, the messy, the complex, the dark, the disturbing, sadness, grief, anger, greed, all the things, without necessarily labeling them good, bad, right, wrong, but finding space for them to coexist so that we can have a look at them and ask questions about, why is that feeling coming up, and what does that mean to me, and does that lead me to an action? All of those really important internal conversations. So do you have any thoughts on spiritual bypassing?
Yeah, I think, as we started the conversation of that, I think to have a spiritual practice allows you to rise above the ugly things that we do as human beings, means that you're aware of those ugly things, right? And how can you be aware of them if you don't do them or feel them or experience them? I think it's almost impossible to have a really meaningful spiritual practice without acknowledging the dark side of being human. And I think sometimes spirituality is equated with that emotional unreactivity, you're not allowed to ever get angry. And in we spoke about this last time that we chatted about parenthood. I get angry so much in parenthood, it scares me a lot. And I'm just like, what is this? But it's, I think, such a really common thing, like mom rage. Totally experience it. And to be able to, on the other side of it is that love and compassion. like, what's going to get me there?
Mm,
What gets me there personally is kind of going, all right, my commitment to my family, which is again another power greater than me. It's
mm.
all, all of us connected. So I just don't really see how it's really possible, like
Yeah.
um to just be that kind of
Good
level, like
vibes only.
good vibes only. I think it's fine if you want to be surrounded by people with good vibes only, and you want to eliminate, toxic friendships, relationships, like
Yeah, for
great,
sure.
like that's
Your
that's
time is
awesome.
precious. Yeah.
Yeah. But at some point, like we also have to embrace our imperfections and
Mhm.
realize that we're like just like you said, muddling through. That's part of
Yeah.
this human existence.
And I guess I would even say, anger, grief, fear, none of these are even imperfections. They're really powerful emotions for a reason. You can imagine that anger on behalf of your child is, the mother ripping the car door off to get her child out after the car
Mm.
accident. And, fear can motivate us to do things that it can take a bit more of a nudge from love to motivate us to do. So I don't
Yeah.
even think of them as imperfections. They can definitely lead us to petty and selfish behavior, but they can also lead us to really powerful behavior on behalf of ourselves and the people around us or the planet or the universe. So yeah, I'm definitely
Yeah,
not the good
agreed.
vibes only person. Although I agree, your time and your energy are precious, and that doesn't mean you need to hang out with people that you feel like are dragging you down. But there's got
Yeah.
to be space to acknowledge that life is
And I
messy
think,
and complex.
yes. And also, if you're not moving through these emotions, if you're not allowing these emotions to arise and to feel
Mm,
them and experience them, and you're essentially stuffing them down, and then all of the patterns just continue, like, the things that you're unhappy with in your life are just going to keep flaring up. And these, disasters perhaps keep coming up because you haven't really dealt with what's at the core of what's
mhm.
showing up for you.
Yes.
So I think that's where the bypassing then comes in, is like you're kind of going like, oh, like I'm okay, everything's fine. But
I'm just going to skip ahead of that part and come out the other side.
yeah,
Yeah.
but then it's almost like you're just constantly skipping
Yeah.
versus really truly perhaps improving.
Hmm. And I think we have this ideal of equanimity, of feeling desire and feeling aversion, but having a part of ourself that is separate enough that we can observe. And for me, that is definitely aspirational. That part does not exist 24/7. It's very dependent on what I've eaten and how much rest I've had and how overwhelmed I'm feeling by life. But that's still the aspiration. And that's one of the reasons why I keep coming back to the practice over and over again, is that I want to be more aware of the power of feelings, and I want to have a part of myself that is able to observe them and have that space to go, why am I feeling this? Why is this coming up for me? Is this motivating me to some action, or do I just want to observe it?
Mm.
But it's very
And yeah,
aspirational.
that juxtaposition I think is so confronting when you first come across that, this concept of practice and non-attachment in yoga
Mhm.
philosophy, that abhyasa and vairagya, like, the non-attachment, or even the non-greediness, non-hoarding. I think, yeah, it's really hard to reconcile in our modern day lifestyle,
Mhm.
and I think where this starts to show up a lot in, shall we say, like soulful entrepreneurs, like yoga teachers or soul centered businesses. You then start to kind of think like, oh, like I should, work for free, or like charge very little money for my
Mhm.
time. Like I shouldn't want to have money. I shouldn't be attached to these results. And
Mhm.
that that's probably a whole nother episode to
Probably.
record.
But I
But
think
it comes,
every yoga teacher on the planet has had that conversation with somebody at some point to say, yes, the yoga is free, but the electricity and the rent I need to somehow pay for.
yes, and I have a family that, or a partner or a house or this or that. We have
Hmm.
really, real world tangible things that, money pays for. But also there's nothing wrong with wanting money. Like, I
Mhm.
think there's such a like taboo around saying that or speaking about it. And um, I think sometimes spirituality can be equated with that, like renouncing of all possessions, anything
Mhm.
material. And if you're not doing that, that you're not spiritual enough.
Mhm.
So for me, that doesn't work for me.
Doesn't work for me either. Yeah. No, I totally agree. So I think we've talked quite a bit about how we see spirituality, what we think it is and what we think it isn't, or some of the places that the waters can get muddy, especially in the really quick conversations that we're able to have on social media. So let's talk about spiritual imposter syndrome or just imposter syndrome in general, because the yoga world is not the only place that comes up. I feel like anywhere people are asked to lead or educate or inspire others, there's definite potential for a percentage of us to feel like I don't know if I'm enough. Am I even the right person to be doing this job?
Mm.
What are your thoughts on imposter syndrome?
What I like to say, like anytime we do a training, is that there are students for every teacher,
Hmm.
and that, the best place to teach from is from your experience. So we've all lived. I always like to, try to do like a calculation of like how many hours you've actually been on this planet, and to teach from those hours, because there's someone that's, who's going through what you've already been through, and you've learned and grown from that experience when it
Hmm.
comes to at least to teaching yoga. I'm not going to speak about other professions. Um, and you're able to share and help from your experience. And so if you're always going back to your own experience, then that I think that is a really great tool for overcoming imposter syndrome,
Hmm.
because when it comes to teaching yoga, you really can't fake it till you make it. That just comes across as being inauthentic, and people can see right through it.
Hmm.
And it doesn't land. You won't teach effective classes if you're just wrote down some notes about something that you read in a book and just try to read it to people like that. Everyone can see right through that. So
Hmm.
I think when it comes to teaching, it's like stay in your lane, teach from your experience,
Hmm.
and be okay with having two or three students maybe when you start, or even
Hmm.
maybe you just prefer to teach one-on-ones, and that's a really beautiful way for you to share and be really confident, to teach what you know. There's
Hmm.
always going to be more to learn. There's always going to be more to discover about yourself. But whether it comes to anatomy or philosophy, or
Yeah, everything.
all the range, everything in between, there's always going to be more to learn. And if we wait until we feel like we have mastered it all, we'll probably never actually get to share these amazing practices.
Yeah. And I feel like I would add too that imposter syndrome can be a little bit of a superpower in a teacher, in the sense that it keeps you really humble. If you're always aware of the many, many myriad things that you don't know, it keeps you open, as opposed to
Mm.
kind of walking in feeling like, I've got this and I'm here to share this information with you, or I'm just going to break it down for you. That doesn't leave you space for interaction to kind of pick up cues and to gather new ways of seeing things, or somebody else's experience that might have differed from yours. So I feel like I would encourage all teachers or would be teachers to embrace that humility and spaciousness. Like, yeah, you know what you've experienced, but there's a million things you don't know, many of which you're aware of, many of which you aren't even aware of yet. So for that to keep you open to learning more, I think is a really powerful place for a teacher to sit.
And it's relatable. I think,
Hmm.
and I think that's one of the best qualities of a teacher, or the teachers that do really well, is because people can relate to them, and everybody can relate to a person who doesn't have it all figured out. Doesn't have all their ducks in a row, or it's and it's okay to for your students to know that about you.
Hmm.
I think that just having that permission to just be yourself.
Yeah, I
in
feel like
that journey.
maybe there's a kind of holdover from the more traditional yoga model of guru student, whereas the modern, at least Western yoga teacher is just a person who has 200 hours or maybe 500 hours or so more education than the students in front of them, just sharing from what they've found helpful. None of us have a lifetime of, deep spiritual practice in a cave in a mountain somewhere. None of us have special insights like that to share. We are just people muddling our way through the world, the same as all of our students are. And I think trying to be anything other than that really sets you up for a a mess, a big messy downfall, because people will find out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it won't take long for them to find out that you don't have the magic. You are just a person trying to figure it out the same way as everybody else is.
Yeah. And I think the more that we can, take ourselves off the pedestal in our students'
For
eye,
sure.
the better in
I
our
feel like my
Western
students
world.
take care of that for me. They keep kicking it out from underneath me. And in fact, I do find any time in my teaching career that I've felt like, okay, I think I've got this. It has preceded some small level of embarrassment, where I get reminded by the universe that you don't really have this. You don't really know this. So I think teaching any kind of public role does have opportunities to regularly humble you. And I think that's a really good thing to keep hold of and to stay in touch with and to learn from.
Yeah, definitely. Um, I think we've both been drawn to those kinds of teachers ourselves. And, um, you know, I mean, you hear all kinds of stories. It is really funny, I think, in the yoga world because maybe we are held to this like higher degree of standards,
Mm.
which maybe rightly so, I don't know. But then um, you hear about these very human fallacies, like mistakes that people make and scandals and things, and sometimes like can be so shocking. But then you're like, well, actually, like we're people, we're
Mhm.
humans, just like everybody else. And I think so many of us, we teach what we're learning, what we want to learn ourselves.
Oh,
Like
yeah,
we absolutely gravitate towards the concepts that we've needed to learn, or that the lessons that we're still learning. um, I don't think you should teach anything that you're going through at the time.
for
You need
sure.
to really like
Give it
have
some space.
processed and integrated, and it be not like necessarily emotional for you at the time. But yeah, we share what is helpful to us.
Mm. So I think you've touched on this quite a bit already, but in all of this kind of conversation around what spirituality is and isn't, and some of the ways that we can interpret it incorrectly according to our definitions, what do you think a spiritual practice then looks like or feels like if it's not necessarily meditation postures and mantras and mudras or chanting? Or I even had somebody say that they thought my class was more spiritual because I use Sanskrit, and I was like, that's just another language. It would be like me saying some words in French. That's not more spiritual. It's just a different language. What could it look like then if it's not any of these things necessarily?
So just to play devil's advocate there, I mean, yes, with French or Sanskrit, but Sanskrit's this ancient language, right? And I think if all you're used to is hearing English, and we're thinking about spirituality as connection to something greater than ourselves, perhaps going back in time to this ancient culture could give people that chance to connect to something greater than themselves, and
Hmm,
perhaps that the sounds of the language, can transport people to another time or place, and
I hear you.
might
And I
have
guess I
that.
was
I don't know
using
if
it
that's
too
how
as
that
a
person meant it.
no, that's a really good point that I hadn't thought of. And even though I was just saying, Bhujangasana, cobra, or Chaturanga Dandasana instead of
Yeah.
low push up, I guess in a way I'm using that language to acknowledge that this is a practice that I didn't make up. It's not something that's brand new. I'm trying to reference where it's come from and acknowledge past teachers and the past wisdom that is the reason that I'm so passionate about the practice. So yeah, fair enough. I didn't
Yeah, I think
perceive
it
it as
carries
spiritual
through.
because I certainly wasn't talking about Patanjali Sutras or the Bhagavad Gita. I really was just naming poses, but fair point.
Which is the point of this conversation
Yeah.
too. It's like that spirituality can really come in so many different ways
Mm.
and perhaps surprise you. And to answer your question, I think it's like when we start to become aware of what is, I'm going to use the word sacred, but it could be even just like what has really great meaning in your
Mm.
life. Notice where that shows up, how it impacts you, and taking the time to acknowledge that you're feeling a sense of trust or a deeper knowing or connection that that your like logical brain maybe isn't going to be like, oh, that's because
Hmm.
XYZ. It's almost like perhaps there is an unexplainable element to it. Or I know I feel it, like I try to ride my bike a lot, and we have like a beautiful bike path here. It takes me by
Mm.
the ocean, and it's like every time I get over the hill and I see the ocean, it's just like flooded with that sense of like, like, this beauty
Ah.
and
I mean, that's what I do literally when
magnificence.
I walk up the mountaintops. It's exactly the same. I walk up, I see row after row of mountains, and it is a literal, look, it's so magnificent, and I'm so tiny. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, you feel your sense of smallness and how
Mm.
there's something so much greater than all of us, and that somebody, a few minutes in front of you or behind you, or in your case maybe several hours,
Fingers crossed.
has had has had the same experience, and
Yes.
that's that connection. So I think, yeah, and this could happen on your bike, it could happen when you're walking, it could happen if you're seated in a meditation, it could happen when you're in a room full of other people doing yoga.
Hmm.
Those moments, I become very obsessed with this phrase, collective effervescence, and
Mm.
it's that feeling that you get when you're with other people, and you have a shared meaning or purpose, and it's that feeling that takes you, somewhere. Becoming aware of those moments, I think, is a really great place to start to develop or become more aware of spiritual experiences.
Mm.
Um, as well as, anytime that you really feel empathy and compassion towards others, the spiritual practice does bring us back to love and compassion. And that might happen quite a lot. And you maybe, prior to this conversation, you might not have thought that could be a spiritual experience, but
Mm.
I think that it is.
I love that. And I feel like you've mentioned quite a few times through this conversation about that space for reflection. So even just creating that little bit of space in daily life to notice moments where you're having spiritual experiences. I can't believe I just said that phrase, but having an experience of being part of something bigger than yourself and feeling that really natural, for me, sense of perspective that it gives, that the things that feel really big when I'm answering my emails on my computer feel right back into perspective when I'm standing on a mountaintop or when I'm looking at the ocean. Like, oh
Mm.
yes, this is what's real. And that stuff
I
is
think,
real, but it's small real. And this is big real.
yeah. And then to those moments where you consciously and purposely decide to be generous
Hmm.
versus selfish, or kind versus, spitefulness, like those moments that connect you to other human beings are also, in my view, spiritual experiences. And anything that really takes you out of the like chaos of the hamster wheel of life and
Hmm.
grounds you, um, for me, goes in the spiritual bucket.
So there's a real undercurrent of intention in noticing, reflecting, and then taking an intention out of that. That
Hmm.
that feeling that we talked about earlier of striving to be a little bit bigger than our small drives. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. But also, I think also, like, let's keep it even simpler than that.
Mm.
It's just that moment, like the moment at the top of the hill, or the moment on a wave, or the moment in nature. You don't even need to put words to it. You can just have that feeling of being like connected into that energy. And because I think reflection and intention starts to really bring like the mind into it, which is great. And there's definitely a side of that for sure. Um, but I suppose I'd also want to kind of be like, it could be just like a bodily experience, if that makes sense. Am
It
I
does.
getting too weird?
No, I love that. And I do think that is the perfect place to start, and maybe the only place to start is to just notice, when I think about the glib little things that I see when I look up quotes on the internet, that you are a spiritual being having a physical experience. It is true to notice those moments where you're aware of that sense of whatever we call it, connection to nature,
Yeah.
a person, an animal. Definitely get that with dogs pretty readily. A feeling,
Yeah. Love
that
that.
natural outpouring of compassion, just to notice and go, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
spiritual experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And allow yourself to have it too.
Mm.
Like allow yourself that time to slow down and to pause and to linger, um,
I'm just
and to
imagining
like
my
not
poor partner. Steve,
rush.
be quiet. I'm having a spiritual experience. Give me a sec. He's definitely going to take me down a peg or two if I try that line, I suspect.
And I'm just come back to what I said before. You're allowed to keep it to yourself.
In some environments, probably recommended. I love that.
Yeah.
So a spiritual practice really could just be noticing those moments in your body where you feel that visceral sense of whatever it is, where it is the communal effervescence, where it is connection to nature, whether it is an upwelling of an emotion, to feel it.
Mm. Yeah. To feel it, to and to just be it, to kind of go like, you know what, like I am kind, I am generous, I can be these things before I have to go and do anything
Mhm. It's already
about
within
it.
me.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
And what about advice for teachers who want to or feel that they should communicate some of these concepts in class, whether that is a Dharma talk at the beginning or the way that we both tend to do it, I think more little sprinklings in throughout the class. What
Yeah,
advice would you give there?
I think it's about finding what works for you. So, I remember being given both um different mentors or teachers at one point saying like, oh, do a dharma talk, and then others being like, no, just get straight into the practice. People want to move their bodies. So I
Mm,
think one is like figuring out, okay, what's going to work for the people that are in front of you, because
mm,
some people really don't want to. I mean, I hear this all the time, like, I just want to start moving my body, I don't want to sit there and listen to my teacher's life and all these things that he's or he has experienced, and their problems and this and that. So I think with the Dharma talk, it's a skill to develop, but that
mm,
might work really well for your audience and your
mhm,
community. Or you might find it easier to begin with to just be able to just to sprinkle some of these concepts throughout. I think first and foremost is like, teach to your strengths.
mhm,
So you might you might only share a little bit of, what really works for you, and you might keep it really, really simple. Um, but even before you begin to kind of share it, I think in your own personal practice, making it more of a um, dedicated or like a more formal practice within yourself to really acknowledge whatever that connection is to you. So maybe, for example, you might be like inviting your higher self into the practice. You might be dedicating your practice to someone or community or, the universe, nature, God. Just that sense of kind of, yeah, transcending or going beyond your small self to something bigger and greater. And you might just have that dedication. You might have that an invitation to kind of allow some of this in. I think speak also to like really what resonates strongly within yourself, which we've already mentioned, teach and share what you put into your practice like on the daily, because it's just going to take away a lot of that anxiety or um, that apprehensiveness that might come along. Like if you're and that's why I say like bring it into your own practice and make it really obvious and acknowledged and formal in your own practice, so that then you feel a connection to it every day, and then it's much easier to share from that place. Does that make sense?
Oh, I could not agree more. 100%. It's got to start with you. It's got to be something that you feel and perhaps have wrestled with, but have some space around now before you can teach it to other people. As you said, sitting and reading a quote out of a book, it's, maybe that will land with someone, but really things land so much more when you're speaking from your experience and from your heart. Mm.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be too remember when I first started teaching, and you kind of referenced this before, like kind of thought, well, it has to be a quote from the Bhagavad Gita if it's going to be, a spiritual sharing or philosophical share.
Mm.
And it doesn't have to be that. It could, the idea of compassion, courage, freedom, acceptance, like these are concepts that tie into spirituality that are universal, that you can speak of without necessarily having to quote an ancient text.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess related to that too is like just being mindful of not going overboard. Remember when I was really brave and courageous, and I was like, I'm going to start sharing lots of yoga philosophy in my classes. And I had another teacher attend, and he said to me, like, this is just like a Tuesday night. People aren't on a retreat.
You had us in chair pose while you read half the Bhagavad Gita. It was a really long time.
Yeah. People are just trying to, unwind from their hectic, busy day, and then they're going to go home and eat dinner, and, just be mindful of that as well. And that's where the sprinkling, I think, comes in really handy. Like, just be
Something that
mindful
you
of not
said
going overboard.
as we were sort of preparing for this conversation that really resonated with me was it's okay to teach a class that just gives people an experience of being in their body and maybe leaving feeling a little bit better in their body. Because if we go right back to you talking about what a spiritual practice could look like, your big thing was you've got to feel it before you can, and maybe instead of trying to intellectualize and put words around, you've got to have that sense of it coming from within, that you're feeling it in your body. And if we're not connected to our bodies, if we're not inhabiting them, how can that ever happen? How will we even be aware of that feeling?
Yeah. And two, we go back to the meaning of yoga and the connection that we're speaking of, and kind of going from that like fragmented view of the world or fragmented view of ourselves to wholeness and connection and oneness. The mind and the body becoming one through the practice of yoga, to me, is also a spiritual experience. That's that, union and connection. And if we can do that as yoga teachers, if we can take people out of their heads and into their bodies through the practice, whether it's postures or breath work, you're doing your job. And and for many people, students, I mean, like that's enough. That's a lot, actually, for
Many
for
teachers
many
too.
people. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I think that gives people a really accessible place to approach spirituality. Like, there's nothing wrong with teaching a practice that helps people connect to their bodies. In fact, it's an incredibly powerful thing to do. And if you are interested in talking about spirituality as a teacher, make sure it's something that you have that visceral experience of, that you have been making a focal point in your practice or inviting into your own personal practice time and time again, that you've sat with and worked on and have a little space around and feel like you're able to share in a way that's concise, where you can drop in just a couple of little pearls and let that be enough, and trust that over time, those little pearls of wisdom will accumulate with the people who need to hear it. And if they
Yeah.
are interested in having more than just a Tuesday night, then you can have a day retreat or a weekend or a week-long retreat where you get to dive into those topics much more deeply together. There's always room for you to develop together. Doesn't all have to happen this Tuesday night.
That's right. And the more that you can present it as an invitation, I think asking questions can be really helpful and allow it to be more of an exploration. I think that really helps for the ideas to land in a way that feels not non-dogmatic, or that is sometimes when we begin to share philosophy and spiritual concepts, there's the trap that we might fall into where we start to think that there's something wrong with us, or that there's something that we need to fix, because we start realizing, like, as we said, like, our human errors and the ways in which we perhaps go astray. And so for me, what I found really works is being able to turn it into a question, into an exploration, and an invitation for people to, if they want to, go a little further with.
I love that. And I think that is really spacious. If you say, is there a way you could invite a little bit more compassion into your practice today? If someone's not interested in that, no big deal. That was 2 seconds of their time. Well, you probably had them in a pose that they were already getting benefit from. No big deal if that just washes past them. But for the person who is ready to hear it, that could really invite some interesting reflection.
Yeah,
Mm,
I love it.
I love that. Any final advice that you would give to somebody who, as a student or a teacher, experiences spiritual imposter syndrome?
Let's turn the compassion towards ourselves. Like, we've been speaking about that quite a lot. And I think if you're having insecurities around philosophy or spirituality, if you're feeling this spiritual imposter syndrome, like, be kind to yourself. I think that insecurities mean that you have a really strong desire to be a great teacher, and it's a reflection of your desire to grow and learn. And I think when we can reframe it in that way, then then we begin to open up the possibilities of moving beyond the syndrome, and kind of going, okay, this is I actually have a really strong desire here to teach really great classes, to share what I love. And it can help also move you beyond the fear of, what if I share and people don't like it or don't want to listen. um, we can just have that compassion for ourselves first and foremost, and then move from that space.
I love that. And I think just embracing the fact that it's keeping you humble, it's keeping you open, and there's always going to be space for you to learn more. Be embracing of that. Hopefully this will continue for the entire rest of your life. You'll continue to
Mm.
learn, and maybe you'll continue to share what you find helpful. So any resources that you'd like to leave people with? I know you have an upcoming monthly dose on yoga medicine online, and you also have a previous one, tips to
Yes.
get the most out of yoga philosophy in your practice.
Yeah, so definitely those 2 monthly doses would
Mhm.
be really great. I have a bunch of classes on yoga medicine online that are spiritually related, I guess, have
Mhm.
more of that philosophical focus, and that you can tell really what they are by their titles, but we might link to maybe
Yeah.
some specific ones. Um, and I think, go and practice with teachers that um, teach in this way. You might even go and take a class with a teacher that perhaps is like way beyond, or like way to the one end of the spectrum, to just kind of see what's out there. And
Mm.
as you said, like, open up to different ways of doing this and what they might. I think sometimes we can learn a lot by, perhaps like the opposite, or like what we um, don't usually do. Like, just explore, be open,
Mm.
and less of a resource, but more of a tip. One final thing I want to say is, you might find that as you begin to share, that some of your students might drop away because they've been coming to your classes maybe because you don't share this kind of thing.
Mm.
But if it's in your heart and if it feels authentic and aligned with what you want to share, I really truly believe that you'll attract even more students, the ones that are really meant to be your students. So if it's in your heart, if it's in alignment, be okay with potentially some of those students deciding that your class is not for them anymore. And you'll be surprised too at maybe some students really enjoy this new aspect that you're sharing.
Yeah, I agree. The only way, if you are a teacher, to teach over the long term is to teach as yourself. It's going to take you way too much energy to be pretending to be somebody else every time you teach. So, for better or worse, you're going to have to embrace yourself and teach from
Yeah.
that. It's really the only way you're going to be able to keep doing it. I love that. I think there are some really beautiful tips here from the super simple, like just noticing moments in your life where you are having a spiritual experience. You're aware of that connection. You're aware of being part of something that's much greater than yourself. And perhaps there's that inspiration to step up to your higher self, to be a little bit more than the petty desires that tend to bubble up every day, right the way through to tips for teaching. Teaching from what you know and you felt in your own practice, teaching from something you've got some level of resolution with or space around, sprinkling in little nuggets, asking questions as opposed to telling people how it is, to create space around that for them. I think there's a lot there for people to take away. Anything that you want to leave us with to finish?
I think you summed up our conversation really beautifully. And yeah, I think that if this is a topic that interests you, just have patience, go
Mm.
slowly, let this develop and unfold. But if, you know, to add on just for what you just said about, sustainability and teaching too, like if you're not sharing this kind of thing and you really want to be, um, give it a go in some way.
Mm.
Reach out. You might be able to get mentored by someone on how to do this, like a teacher that you feel does it really, really well. Like reach out to them. They might be, able to help you in really more specific, practical ways. I think it's really important if it's something that you feel called to do because otherwise you're going to start getting bored with
Mm-hmm.
what you're teaching, and um, you want to keep developing and growing your own skill set so that it is fulfilling for you to keep doing what you're doing. So that would
I
be my
agree.
last probably tip and advice is just reach out and ask for help.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today and for sharing all your experience and your expertise. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure, Rachel. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our Yoga Medicine community.
The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.